Second, and it is good. Thank you.
Great. We have a couple more minutes here. Let's, Kaden, how about you? What are you looking for in this presentation?
Hi, my name is Kaden. Similarly to what Kirk said, I'm also just looking forward to seeing everyone's different perspectives on this topic. And I'm working with spiritual life. So after this presentation, later in the week, we will set up an interview to kind of talk about what we discussed in this Zoom session. So I will be in contact with you after we do this session.
Great. Thanks for your work at Springfield College. This is a real historic meeting, I think, yeah? Tien, how about you? Am I saying that right, Tien?
Yes, you did say right.
Great. What are you looking for today?
Oh, I just want to learn more about the topic. You know, I just recently I read was it a book about white privileges? So I'm just curious about the topic. That's all.
All right, great. Nice to have you here. Teresa Burr, how about you?
Hi, I'm just here to gain an understanding and more knowledge about the topic and just the thoughts that are going on at Springfield College since I was there in 1970.
Oh, so nice for you to be here. Thanks for being here. Hey, my
Thank you.
Damon, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Wonderful. How's that boy of yours?
Oh, he's doing well. He's doing
Great.
well.
Nice to see you here. David
yeah.
is involved in a lot of media projects at Springfield College, so we thank him for his service to the college. Thanks for everything, David.
Oh, my pleasure. You gotta keep me busy. I apologize. It's been a couple weeks since I've connected with you, so I apologize. But always a pleasure to work with you.
Always nice to work with you too. Callie, how about you? Callie Dowd.
Hi. I just have been attending a lot of these different sessions just because I think that they're very interesting and I want to learn more. So I just decided to join this one as well.
Aren't they great? Aren't they great?
They are. They're amazing.
Wonderful. Really. Rachel Drummond. How are you? How are you, Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Drummond. I'm just here because I'm interested to learn more about this topic. And I also read in one of my classes about white privilege. And it's definitely something I'm interested in learning more about.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here today. We're going to start in just a couple minutes, but I can hear from Gannon Olson. Just want to check in with you, Gannon. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm currently a Springfield College student enrolled in the physical education program, and I just want to learn more about this topic because it's just a very, at this time in the United States, it's a very present topic, and it's something that we should all just learn about and understand to have a better conversation between people.
It's a historic time in this country. Historic time. Let's see. Felicia, thank you so much, Felicia, to you and your team. What a wonderful historic meeting. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, Michael, thank you. I am so pleased. We have over 1,000 participants this week, and we are super excited. And thank you for leading the session. Thank you all for attending. And I encourage you all to, I'll put in the chat to an evaluation. We are trying to get as much feedback because we want to continue this and institutionalize this. So again, everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you, Michael, for presenting, and we really appreciate you all.
Thank you so much, Mason, how about you? What are you looking for here today?
Tacos, and I just want to do. I'm just looking to get educated and do some more on my part, and just try to see different perspective.
That is nice to have you here. We appreciate it. I'm going to get started in just a second here. We got a nice crowd here. I'll tell you, we got a nice crowd and they're still checking in. We're going to start with the recording here. Let me just see what we got here. We're doing very good. Okay. Let's see if I can master this. Oh, it's recording. Can I record too to have a copy or no?
Michael, we're gonna post all, so we're working with David McMahon and some other folks. We're gonna have all of the recorded sessions on our website, and so folks can find it there, and I'm sure we'll figure out a way to share that with you too, Michael, directly. So
that would be good. I want to use it in my classes, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have all the sessions that are being recorded so people have access to that.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, folks, my name is Michael DeAndrea, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Counseling here at Springfield, Massachusetts. Meichi, how are you? See some of the students here today. Nice to see you.
Good, Dr. D. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. Sharice, nice, wonderful job, wonderful job. Okay, I hope to have, we can save some time for discussion. I'm gonna provide some content for a 4-quadrant model on white racism. This program is designed to expand our thinking about the manifestation of white racism, and we'll walk through it, and we're looking forward to some good conversations. Let's see if I can, before I get started, although I have said thank you to a couple people here today, Felicia and Sharice, let me once again say how delighted it is to have you as leaders in our community and to put on this unprecedented and historic event where we have the entire week to kind of explore important issues. You make our college community better. You make Springfield better. You make our society better. Thank you for your tireless efforts. I'm just amazed at how you've pulled this off with the technology base to it and everything. You all are really, really just terrific, and thank you very much. Let me go to the PowerPoint here. If Felicia, if you could nod, if you can see that on the screen, okay?
Yeah,
okay.
and can I just remind folks, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Or whomever is co-host can mute people, just so that Michael has the floor.
Great. We're going to walk through this, and we're going to look forward to conversation. The title of this presentation is Expanding our Understanding of White Racism. There was an earlier presentation with a panel of individuals. One of them was a Ms. Harris, about the importance of expanding our thinking about scholarship at Springfield College and other colleges around. She talked about how scholarship needs to be tied.
Y'all are fucking stupid, bro.
I think we have someone that needs to mute their.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You can, Michael, you also, if you're the host, can mute people, or if you have a co-host or want to make me a co-host, I can help you.
Yeah, can I do that? Can you do that in case I get, let's see. Oh, let's just try it a little bit, see if everyone is cool, okay? And this Ms. Harris talked about scholarship, right? And I have been developing a relationship with the oldest running African-American newspaper and magazine in Springfield. Some people have heard of this, right? It's Point of View in here. For those of you that are interested in expanding your understanding of African-American issues in Springfield, and I've developed a relationship, and this past month I have an article published in here entitled Expanding Our Understanding of White Racism, and I'll be taking information from that article out. And this is my effort. I'm developing a project called Engage Scholars at Springfield College. And this is an effort to get people to do, publishing in journals and things like that. But we could do a much better job of empowering and engaging the Springfield College community with other outlets that we get our information out to the general public, the mass public. We are engaged in not a reform movement, but we are engaged in a historic revolutionary shift in our society, nationally, statewide, and locally. We can do a better job as scholars, engaging and getting our message out as scholars to people in the general public. We have referred to that as a professional counselor myself, giving psychology and counseling away. I mean, how many people really in the general public read these journal articles, right? And yet they remain the basis for tenure and promotion. And that's fine. We need to keep doing that. But we need to also extend it, as Ms. Harris had talked about earlier today. The presentation today is is going to begin by I'm going to kind of, I just put this on to highlight some points. And, once again, the people of the United States are pressed to reflect on the complex problem of white racism, right? Isn't that what's happening here? The recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other unarmed Black and brown men and women by law enforcement officials are stimulating renewed concern about the persistence of this social, political, economic cancer we refer to as white racism and white supremacy in our nation.
Michael, can you put it in present mode so it's larger for more accessibility for people to read? Is that possible?
I can. What do I do? Let me see. I go
If you go to slide. Yep, there you go. And from beginning, or well, from current slide actually. Yep, perfect. And thank you.
So although enduring demands for corrective action has been a part of our country's historic legacy for racial justice, there's a couple of factors going on here that make this time distinguished from other times that are going on. There is a current call of conscience that are built on past efforts for racial justice. One of the big factors here is the availability of social media that provides unequivocal evidence of the indisputable murders of unarmed Black and brown men and women by law enforcement persons in our society. This social media impact is penetrating some of the apathy that has marked the way many white persons react to social injustices in the past and unfortunately at the present time. The second factor is the rising number of white persons who willingly and publicly display their abhorrence of the recent murders by supporting the Black Lives Movement. This is resulting in really a unique multiracial unification that has too often been absent in such large numbers in the past. My interpretation about the increased number of white persons in terms of the current racial justice movement driven by the Black Lives Movement is the time when we saw all across our nation George Floyd calling the spirit of his mother with a knee to his neck, preventing him from breathing. You remember that. George cried out at the end, "Mama, Mama, Mama." And she answered him. And she said, "Come on, George, it's okay. Come here. You can breathe here. You'll be okay." And he made the transition. There was something about that historic moment that seems to have touched the soul of many white persons, particularly liberal individuals in our society who heretofore have played the tune of apathy too loudly in refusing to address various forms of white racism and white supremacy in our society. As a white anti-racist, I've spent the past 40 years learning about many of the idiosyncrasies of white racism through my own personal experiences as a racially privileged individual. These experiences are complemented by the 4 decades I've spent as a faculty member and a social scientist in a number of universities and colleges across the United States. The insights that I've gained from these experiences has increased my understanding of the very narrow ways many, perhaps most white people think about white racism. The following information is based on my personal experiences as a white privileged male in our society, as well as 40 plus years as a social scientist studying the cancer in our society that is based upon white racism and white supremacy. I'm going to talk briefly about 4 types of white racism. You know, it's interesting how a complex phenomenon like white racism needs to be repeated. I teach in a graduate program, and oftentimes graduate students will say, geez, I read that last week, Dr. D. I read that last week about social justice. I got that one down. Well, you're a better person than I am, my friend, because it normally takes me 2 to 3 times reading something to get it down and fully understood. There was an incident in one of my graduate classes where an African-American male talked about simply not being heard and not being interested in participating in what we were discussing, which was mutual respectability and mutual empathy, because he felt that the people in Springfield College, and students in particular, were not responsive and did not demonstrate the empathy that he sought to engage in mutually interpersonally respectful ways. So we conducted a in-class presentation. It's called the fishbowl experiment. And the first question we asked was, what's the definition of racism? This is graduate students. 18 people were in a circle, and we had the fishbowl, which was all white persons in the fishbowl, and the other observers were kind of observing what was going on. Not one of the 18 students who had previously taken a diversity class were able to articulate a definition of white racism. Not one. This kind of helps us understand that every class, and with the help of Dr. Christopher Hakala in the Center of Teaching Excellence, we need to have a roadmap and a mandate for us to repeat lessons about white racism and other injustices more than once, more than in one class on diversity counseling, so that we can capture and understand and own the knowledge of the meaning of the 4 forms of white racism we're exploring today. Overt, intentional white racism. This is reflected among white persons commonly associated with the Ku Klux Klan and other domestic terrorist groups. Yes, other domestic terrorist groups. What distinguishes this type of racism from others is the way that white people openly, intentionally, and without any remorse express hatred and engage in violent actions towards persons of color. Clearly, this form of white racism is unquestionably unacceptable. It nevertheless gains much of the attention in the mass media. Despite the major attention the media gives to overt intentional racism, it is important to understand that the overall negative impact of overt intentional white racism pales when compared to other forms of racism in our society. Now, when I was working as a therapist in my employment position while getting a doctorate degree at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, I was asked to conduct an intake interview with a white male who was known to routinely behave in ways that are consistent with overt intentional white racism. During this psychological intake, this client readily talked about his deep hatred of Black persons. As the interview proceeded, he readily stated, and I quote, "I hate Black people. I hate Black people because they're lazy, they're smelly, they're dangerous, and they're only interested in staying on welfare," unquote. This white male showed no remorse for his hatred and further stated that, quote, "White people have to take our country back before Blacks take it over," close quote. These behaviors were a frightening example of how overt intentional racism continues to be manifested and promoted by the President of the United States of America. Armed militia identifying themselves as part of white nationalist, white supremacy groups are at a dangerous level of numbers in our society. Overt intentional racism. Overt unintentional white racism. I submitted an article to the Boston Globe that discusses these issues, as well as to the local newspaper called The Republican. Yeah. And the editor at The Republican contacted me by phone because he'd like to have this published in a November edition of that newspaper and said, man, when you talked about overt unintentional racism, I thought about how I fit that. I was not aware of that. Overt unintentional white racism is similar to overt intentional racism because both of these forms of racism reflect open and public displays of racist thinking and behaviors. But one main difference is that overt unintentional racism, while yes, it is open and public, it is not done consciously and it is not done with intentional racist intent. One example of this form of white racism occurred when I was working as an athletic counselor in the athletic department of a large public university. During one of the men's basketball team's practices, a white player, one of the co-captains on the team, jokingly said to another player, quote, "Get your cotton picking hands off me," close quote. This statement was made when his teammate was playing very tight defense to stop him from making a shot near the basket. Well, as you might imagine, this incidence of overt unintentional white racism caused an uproar among the black players who demanded an apology from this white player. As the athletic counselor for this group, I worked to address the racially charged situation as the African-American players acknowledged that while they did not believe that their white teammate's comment was made intentionally as an intentional racist act, but was rather an unconscious manifestation of his ignorance to its negative impact on other African Americans. We processed this information in a number of team meetings, and ultimately, this event turned into an important learning experience as the white player expressed remorse and embarrassment. He also stated interest in learning more about the ways that other white people exhibit overt, unintentional racism without understanding its negative impact on many persons of color. Covert, unintentional racism. Many of our administrators and faculty members and students at the graduate and undergraduate level manifest covert, unintentional racism without being aware of it. Covert, unintentional racism refers to behaviors that are not overt, they're not open, they're not public, but nevertheless, they allow racial injustices to go unchallenged by unintentionally perpetuating institutional racism through our collective white silence. I had an article published several years ago that gained some notoriety among colleagues in the field, some who were supportive, some who were detractors, entitled "The Violence of Our Silence in the Counseling Profession." An example of this type of white racism occurs when good-hearted and well-meaning white teachers, white counselors, and white administrators help to administer racially biased tests and related educational assessments in school settings. Certainly, all of us have experienced the distribution of tests that many educational researchers have pointed out that such tests and assessment processes have what's called questionable validity and reliability when they're used among racially diverse students. This is what's commonly referred to as institutional racism. The continued use of racially biased testing and assessment tools that has created a billion, not a million, $1 billion industry that leads to inaccurate interpretations and scores among many persons of color. The researchers that have studied this phenomena explain further how racially flawed tests result in a broad range of negative educational assessments of racially different students that have an adverse impact on many non-white students. This phenomena and the silence of white persons who are teachers, well-meaning and good-hearted counselors, good-hearted and well-meaning administrators who are not aware of the biases inherent to this multi-billion-dollar industry cannot and must not be left off the hook of responsibility as a result of perpetuating institutional racism through their silence and covert unintentional racism. This section of my presentation has to do what I've entitled the Massachusetts Test for Teachers' Licensure. The acronym is MTELS. This is a controversy that indeed exists at Springfield College and represents one form of covert unintentional racism. Every teacher and school counselor that wants to get licensed in the state of Massachusetts must take this test called MTELS. Now, MTELS seem to consistently result in the failure of a disproportionate number of teachers in training and school counselors in training. In other words, there seems to be a racial bias in the scoring of these instruments that lead to a disproportionately high number of teachers of color in training and school counselors in training to fail. It costs over $100 to retake the MTELS. Obviously, there's an inherent internalized embarrassment when a person fails the MTELS. And again, this phenomena of institutional racism with flawed MTELS, the MTELS have not been tested nor found to be valid or reliable as measures of teacher and school counselor proficiency and competence. In fact, in 2009, there was a court case that went up the chain of courts in Massachusetts, articulating that this form of institutional racism has to end with these culturally biased tests. In fact, as a member of a committee last year at Springfield College, I learned that there was a time when teacher education and counselor education programs that have these teacher students and counselor education students for a minimum of 2.5 years. Faculty members at Springfield College have a much broader and intense assessment of how students are doing to match up with the competencies that are alleged to be measured by the MTELS. And there was a time when those teacher education and counselor education programs that were certified by the State Board of Education could sign off and replace the MTEL scores. Somehow in history, the MTELs restored. We have people who are in administrative positions that are aware of this institutional form of racism. Many students are not aware of the bias in the MTELs and the disproportionate number of persons of color in teacher education programs and counselor education programs. If you are not aware of what's going on here, then remaining on the sidelines and not addressing this form of institutional racism is referred to as unintentional support for this form of white supremacy. As controversial as it may be, and it is controversial, and one risks having retaliation by raising these issues as social justice advocacy issues in need of attention, we place ourselves at risk for various forms of alienation with our colleagues and retaliation in the worst case scenario. It is important to acknowledge that white teachers, counselors, and administrators who engage in this covert, unintentional racism, yes, they inadvertently perpetuate institutional racism in our public education system. Anti-racist white allies acknowledge the importance of unveiling how this form of covert, unintentional racism persists in our educational system, so that appropriate corrective action can be implemented to eradicate this racial injustice. And that's the intent in bringing this form of white racism to your attention. Now, of course, once an administrator or a faculty member or a student in teacher education or a student in counselor education is made aware of the racial bias inherent in the MTELs and proceeds to do nothing to raise their voice in resistance, now that individual, because they're made aware of this form of white racism, now they, as administrators and faculty members and students, become a part of covert, intentional white racism. Now, researchers have shown that covert, intentional white racism, that is racism that's perpetuated by people who are knowledgeable of the biased tests that continue to be used in our public school system, as well as with the MTELs. This is arguably the most pervasive and most dangerous and most harmful form of racism in our nation. This type of white racism has a negative impact among groups of persons of color when compared to the more limited negative impact of overt intentional and overt unintentional white racism. Overt unintentional white racism has been highlighted, but what's referred to as microaggressions. You may have heard that term, microaggressions. Microaggressions are defined as unconscious behaviors that help to denigrate unintentionally persons from marginalized racial groups in our society. A lot of attention on microaggressions, and there needs to be. However, the use of microaggressions pales in terms of the negative impact of covert, intentional white racism that underlies and fuels white supremacy in our public schools and in our training programs. Now, one does not have to openly express racial hatred or articulate obscene racial comments publicly to be guilty of perpetuating covert intentional racism. Again, I want to emphasize that persons who are operating from covert intentional racism are oftentimes churchgoers, well-meaning, hardworking, with good intention, but they simply miss the boat in terms of standing up and doing what the late John Lewis talked about, is being willing to get into trouble when it's good trouble. Instead, this form of racism occurs when white persons create policies and or support other persons' policies that are intentionally designed to disadvantage racial minority persons. Now, there's a pattern of actions by President Donald Trump over a long period of time that are clear examples of how covert, intentional white racism continues in our society. These examples include in a court decision in the 1970s, Donald Trump was found guilty of implementing racially discriminating housing policies while building his real estate empire in New York City. Donald Trump expressed his support for the stop and frisk policy that was promoted by Mayor Giuliani in New York City, as this institutionalized racist policy was implemented from 2004 to 2012. President Donald Trump's recent efforts to dismantle the Fair Housing Act, the federal legislative policy that supports African Americans' chances to secure fair housing opportunities in our nation, are all examples of how white supremacy and covert intentional racism is perpetuated at the highest levels of our government. As I previously stated, covert intentional racism continues to be manifested by administrators and faculty members and students who are aware of the disparity that exists in failure rates among students of color when taking the MTEL exam. Again, I want to repeat, as controversial as it may be, it is important to acknowledge that white teachers, counselors, and administrators who engage in this kind of covert intentional racism inadvertently perpetuate institutional racism in our public education system. Anti-white allies acknowledge the importance of unveiling how this form of covert intentional racism persists in our educational system so appropriate corrective action can be taken. This is a time in our history when our moral development and ethical commitment for justice is being tested. There are other types of overt and covert forms of intentional and unintentional racism that are perpetuated as a result of our silent complicity in our community and at our college. For instance, it is obvious to all of us that our schools in Springfield, Massachusetts are segregated at a level that corresponds to the segregation of the mid-1960s. And yet, this segregated school policy that continues to be perpetuated operates without sustained resistance and calls for change. We seem to have bought into the idea that, well, Dr. D, I think it might be here to stay. I'm not sure what we can do about our segregated public schools. Another area that we remain silent on, and it's very controversial, is when we avoid to address the economic injustices among people of color, and particularly among African-American families and Latinx persons, when we fail to publicly discuss the importance of dealing with reparations from the stolen lands and from personal enslavement that is a sin on our nation's history. Think to yourself the last time anyone initiated a conversation about reparations, and now pause to think about the last time you heard a white person initiate a discussion of reparations as part of our social justice advocacy efforts in this country. We're going to talk a little bit later at another presentation about the 21st century minimum requirements that should be implemented for high-level administrative and decision-making positions in higher education and future administrative decision-making positions at Springfield College. This includes the hiring and minimum requirements required for applicants for the president of our college, for vice presidential positions in our college, for board of regents at our college. We need to look at and examine what level of multicultural and social justice advocacy competence do applicants to these high-level decision-making positions bring to the table via formal, not incidental, but formal professional training in multicultural and social justice competency training? And do they demonstrate the awareness, knowledge, and skills that are reflected in previous employment positions? Over the past several months, I've been invited to meet with students at Springfield College, and I've noticed a phenomena that's common. in organizations dealing with racism in their confines. That common pattern is that stakeholders and decision makers and administrators oftentimes pose the following response. You know, the students just don't give us enough credit for what we're doing. They're not paying attention to the long laundry list of things that we've done over the past years to address diversity issues. And then there are students who are saying, these administrators don't understand that they are not doing enough or hitting on the core issues that represent racism in our midst. Oftentimes, students are turned to create an outline of different new policies that should be developed and implemented at Springfield College. When we're paying high salaries for administrators and decision makers who should be able to develop and implement not reformist policies, but transformative and revolutionary changes in our policies and practices. Unfortunately, if we were to search out the training of high-level administrators and decision makers, we might be disappointed to see that their level of multicultural and social justice competence falls below the standards of many students of color in colleges and universities across the United States and here at Springfield College. These and other issues will be addressed in a Friday presentation that I'll be presenting entitled Continuing the National Discussion of Race, Justice, and Peace, a College Community Town Hall Project. This project has gone on for numerous years. It's a project that I helped to coordinate by having town hall meetings in 11 different cities that have involved more than 3,300 persons. And currently there is an asserted call for action to implement this project by convening a town hall meeting here in our own community at Springfield College and in the broader Springfield community. I hope that you found the information presented to not only be controversial, which I do hope it has, but that it leads to your inspiration to take new action, to speak up, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, and to help us realize our untapped potential for greatness in dealing with the transformative changes that are being called for in order to ameliorate the complex problem of white racism and white supremacy in our institutions. I hope we have some time for discussions at this point or comments.
Michael, there's a comment in the chat. There's actually a couple. I can read them if that's helpful for you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so Charity says, out of curiosity, since we were on the topic of covert versus unintentional in regards to Donald Trump, what type of racism would Donald Trump's New York Times article call for executions of the Central Park Five be considered? They were guilty at the time of the article, but there was no evidence to support the conviction, just trying to sort it out with real world examples.
Excellent. Who was that by?
That's one of our actually alumni, I believe, if it's Charity, I think it's, yes, she's shaking her head. Charity was actually an intern in the Office of Multicultural Affairs at one point when I started. So that's one of our alums, Charity.
Charity, thank you so much for adding to the long, long, long list of racist behaviors by soon to be the ex-president of the United States. Hopefully the ex-president of the United States, as long as everyone here can bring 5 people with them on November 3rd to vote for Joe Biden and company in order to alleviate us of this white supremacist behavior. You're right. If anyone hasn't heard the story about the Central Park 5, you need to educate yourself on that. That was a horrific injustice. And even though the perpetrator of that crime was found and admitted and was tested positive for DNA, Donald Trump, I won't even refer to him as president, he's not my president, who talked about, well, you know, there's still some question about that Central Park 5. But then let's go to another one. Really? You're going to call African countries the shithole countries of the world when they have a substantially lower rate? I was told today in a report, 35,000 people have died in the continent of Africa from the pandemic. 35,000 compared to our 220,000 in this country. Mr. President, I'm wondering who the shithole nation is you're referring to when you compare us to Africa. That's another one. What about stripping the children from the parents' arms? I advocate for nonviolent civil disobedience and have been arrested on one occasion for standing up for racial justice in a nonviolent civil disobedience mirror. But I'll tell you one thing. If I was at the border of Mexico and the United States and a law enforcement officer came up to me and tried to strip my daughter from my arms, that would be a test of my commitment. Another example of a policy that was hauled in by Donald Trump. So thank you, Charity. There's a long list. Right? Mexicans are rapists. Just a long list. It's time for us to take action and get rid of this person. I'll say it publicly. An evil spirit at the head of our government.
Michael, oops, I'm sorry.
Remove him. Go ahead.
There's another question here. It says, what can I do as a future teacher when I have to administer tests for my job that I believe to be radically biased, but if I refuse, I would lose my job? What can I do about the issues with the MTELs? I have to make them to get a job I have to take them to get a job as a teacher, but I don't want to partake in covert intentional racism.
And we have to pay the rent and we have to pay for our food. Yes, it's a very important question. 4 points. Number one, you begin by getting allies at your school. Educate the allies who may not be aware of the racism that's perpetuated in distributing these tests or in the MTELs. Number one, get a base. Get a base. A base can be 3, 5, 10, 12, 15 colleagues at your school. Then take your base and go to the administrator, the principal of the school, who is not trained to know about covert, unintentional, and overt intentional racism, and discuss with your policymaker, the principal of the school, the need for us to address this issue at where? Point number 3, the Board of Education meeting. Take the principal and your base and parents of color whose kids are being subjected to this injustice, and go to the Board of Education, not once, not twice, but as many times during the academic year, the Board of Education convenes. This won't change in 1 year. We're looking at a 3 to 5 year change going on here. And when you have your base and you get children and adolescents to be your base, don't forget to bring those placards, right? That say stop the racism in Springfield College public schools. We have to rise up like the young generation are teaching us. So number one, talk to your colleagues, form a base. Number 2, have the base meet with the decision maker. 3, have the base and the decision maker and parents and students of color go to board meetings. Number 4, continue this practice and get in touch with the media so that the television crews and the radio crews will come and document what you're doing there. Open this up to the city of Springfield, and they will come running to you, support your efforts here. I hope that addresses the question with those 4 points.
Michael, I have a question. As a woman of color, and I think there's a difference between me and you, with some of the conversations and whom we're having those conversations in safe spaces. What advice would you give to your white colleagues as well as your colleagues of color doing this work in terms of feeling safe? And then also, you mentioned sort of at the border, right, with if your kid was being ripped from your arms. I think it's very different for, a community or a family of color with maybe minimal resources versus someone else. And can you talk a little bit maybe about both from the white perspective and then also, advice you would give to your white colleagues who could better support the BIPOC community or communities that are targeted or that don't carry the same power access that others do?
Great question. Right now, I'm involved in a qualitative study that looks at validating a new theory I have. It's called social justice activistic-ism. It's a long title. It's called social justice activistic-ism. It's similar to racism and sexism, only the negative and the retaliatory behaviors that social justice advocates, we know this. We are subjected to retaliation and conditions in our employment that do not demonstrate respect but are discriminatory. If anyone would like to kind of join in this research project, please let me know. We're doing focus groups on this. So number one, let it be clear, Felicia, I don't feel safe at Springfield College. I hope no one here thinks I feel safe. Providing the information I just presented here in a public forum, I don't feel safe. I sit among colleagues at this college who know what is wrong about our tests and the MTELs and remain silent. I understand that the salary issue and the financial issue is an important motivator to remain silent. But the time has come for, and my advice to people is, help contribute to the revolution going on. Pay attention to the young people in our society who are standing up across this nation, taking risks. You talk about taking risks. These young people are protesting while the militia are taking aim with armed weapons. I tell my colleagues, please stand up. I'm not going to sit down. Please be true to your values. Please be true to your ethics. Please be true to the higher standards that Dr. King and Malcolm X talked about that you have readings in your classes. My guess is that 5% of the staff at Springfield College really has the conviction to stand up tall and implement nonviolent disobedience on campus. Maybe 5%, maybe not 5%. If we want to recruit persons of color, can we please have Alden Street painted Black Lives Matter? If we really want to have people of color say, Springfield College is where I want my kid to go, they have to go beyond saying, Dr. King was there in the 60s. No, this is 2020. Paint with privilege our values about Black Lives Matter. Those are the type of things I say. I hope that answers your question a little bit, Felicia.
Yes, thank you. Also, Dr. DeAndre, we have an individual who would like to know more about your research. May I share your email address so that they can reach out to you?
Oh, please do. Thank you so much for doing that. The more we can work together. I'm so impressed with the work that Calvin Hill has done on campus. I'm so impressed with the social work program. We have kind of been united in counseling with people there. There's a gentleman, I don't know him that well, his name is David Rudder, and there's Tony Hill, I think. I'm just so excited about working with these colleagues because these people are at the forefront of the revolution. And I don't have to apologize for, say, the revolution. There's a revolution happening here. Have you ever noticed how many white people kind of on the side, we need reform, we need reform? No, we don't need reform. We got enough reform. We need transformative changes that represent the revolution of humanity that's unfolding to now. Don't be bashful. Don't be shy. To my white colleagues and brothers and sisters, speak up about the revolution. And this time, the revolution will be televised. Any other comments or questions?
I don't see anything in the chat here, Michael.
Let me kind of end up here is to say something that sometimes people say to me when I travel the country and do workshops. Dr. DeAndrea, that was real passionate. That was really interesting. Those are hard things, my brother, Dr. DeAndrea. Other people have come up to me and said, that's impossible, man. We're not going to desegregate our schools. We're not going to have meaningful police reform. It's impossible. And you know something, all of us, and I would say to my white brothers and sisters in particular, we have to be on our game to answer the questions. Who must do the hard things? Who must do the impossible things? And who must do the hard things in life? Those who can. Those who can and have stood up in defiance against the war in Vietnam, the desegregation in our schools, standing up for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender rights in our country. Only those who can stood up for the hard things. But who must do the impossible things, my friends? Those who care. Those who care have always done the impossible things. With that, let me extend a personal wish to all of you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and please go out from this presentation and this week's forum to love somebody just a little bit more. What we need in this world is love, sweet love. We need love, sweet love. Aloha to you all. Let's move together as a united front to create real change at Springfield College. In peace to you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, Michael. Please, everyone, fill out the forms for feedback. We are trying to gain as much feedback. It's in the chat there. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Michael, and enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. We look forward to seeing you in other sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good day.